Friends, uh, now to the final concept, namely the concept of climate justice. All this becomes extremely relevant. All our discussion which we had in our course becomes extremely relevant and very pressing. If we look at the warning which has been issued by a scientific body, this warning talks about the large scale impacts, and it says that these large scale impacts are irreversible, they are abrupt, they are unpredictable, and if we don't do anything about it urgently, uh, we would be in crisis. And hence, I'll just read out this statement first before we uh, look at the concept of climate justice. So, what this scientific body is hinting at is the sea level rise, which is going to happen. It is going to trigger the abrupt changes in the system, and these abrupt changes would be because of the global temperatures past the certain threshold. Thresholds, we talked about the thresholds like 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial level or 2 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial level and so on. So what it means is that we would reach a threshold, and if that point or that threshold point is reached, and if we uh, and even if we don't add uh, carbon dioxide into the atmosphere when the once the threshold point is reached, then what would happen is there would be potentially unstoppable processes set in motion. So we can think of this as a sudden climate break and steering failure. So they call it as a brake and steering failure, where the problem and its consequences would no longer be under control of the mankind. And if this is so clear to the scientific body, then what is the point of climate justice? So, to understand climate justice, I have borrowed a statement made by an expert from a Latin American country, Bolivia. What he says and what he said at a conference was millions and millions of people living in the small islands, least developed countries, as well as all around the world, are suffering from the effects of a problem, the climate change problem, to which they did not contribute. So, this is what is the climate justice definition, in my words. Uh, what it means is that there is a climate change, but this climate change is going to impact millions of people in the small countries, least developed countries, and there will be suffering all around. And this suffering would be in spite of the fact that they didn't trigger the climate change. So, it is not enough to talk about the emissions goal, enough to talk about what temperatures we are reaching, how much carbon space is being utilized, and so on. We need to focus on the carbon budget as we had done in the previous lectures, and we need to look for the historic emissions. And then we need to ask a question as to who has contributed to the climate change, and then we would be addressing the issue of equitable approach towards decarbonization, or in other words, climate justice. So what is climate justice is we'll have to take an equitable approach towards decarbonization while being sensitive about the development needs of those who are not yet industrialized. So, if you look at why the system is so unjust, we need to look at some data. So, some data we had already looked in our previous lectures, But to make the point more clear, I take the example of electricity consumed in three different continents, three different groups. One is the Europe, other is America, and third is Africa. So find clearly that there is a stark contrast in the consumption of electricity where America per head, per person, that is per year, is consuming around 13,000 units of electricity. Europe is consuming half of that, 6,500 units of electricity per head. And if you look at the data of the least developed countries, the African countries, you'd find that the consumption is as low as 200 units of electricity per year. So when you say climate justice, what it means is that America and Europe, they should drastically cut down their electricity consumption, and Africa should be allowed to consume some electricity to fulfill its basic needs. Another way of looking at it is the greenhouse gas emissions. So if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions from America, United States of America, you'll find that per capita it is 16 tons. China, which is again a major country, a more populous country, is having 8 tons per capita per year as a consumption, emission of carbon dioxide. And European Union, it is about the same as that of China, whereas India is at 1.6 tons per capita per year. The other developing countries and least developed countries have the per capita emissions much lower than unity. So it means that, again, when we talk about climate justice, we need to look at the top greenhouse gas emitters, as has been pictorially represented here, both on the absolute basis, that is, what are the total amount of emissions they have contributed to, right? Absolute, how many gigatons of CO2, and on a per capita basis also. So, both this would help us provide some framework of addressing the climate change in an equitable manner. So, this is what is the equitable approach towards decarbonization or climate justice. Another important data which one would like to focus, and which is not generally talked about when we talk about climate change, is the emissions from military. If you look at the spending on military by the top countries, top emitters, you'll find that they have spent a lot on military, and they are, because of their expenditure on military, there is tremendous carbon footprint generated. For example, the military carbon emissions from America, United States of America, is 205 million tons, whereas that of European Union is 20 million tons. So, considering that the carbon footprint of the global militaries is substantial, it is much more than what is contributed by civil aviation. Civil aviation is 2.5%, but military is double of that. It is around 5.5%. So that also becomes an important issue. So, what is equally important in climate justice is the making sure that the military expenditure is curtailed and the expenditure on military is reduced, right? It means, in other words, there has to be peace. If you look at the data on the military expenditure, you will find that there is direct correlation. So America is spending the maximum, and it is $6,250 billion was its expenditure in the data in the period of 13 to 21, 20 in a decade or so. So in a decade, it has spent $6,215 billion. China also has spent $2,000 billion. Russia has spent $630 billion. So all this, if you look at, and if you look at the emissions, you will find that there is a direct correlation between the military expenditure and the emissions from military. So if something has to be done, we need to make sure that this is reduced. Military expenditure is reduced, and hence the emissions from military are reduced. So this is again another way of looking at the just and peaceful world we dream of. So, if I want to borrow the word some words of a Bolivian ambassador. Climate justice would mean that if and he used a very touchy sort of analogy. What he says is that if I burned your house, means if the developed countries have burned your house, the least I can do, means the least the developed world can do, is welcome you into my house. So the developed world, if there is a submergence of land, for example, of people from Bangladesh, what could what could a developed world do? A developed world could welcome you into their country. This is one of the expectation of climate justice. And the second thing is, if I am burning it right now, okay, if it has been I'm burning it, I should try to stop the fire now. Okay, so the annual emissions have to be stopped immediately, right? So who should stop them? Those who have burned the house, means those who are responsible for the climate change, they should immediately halt the emissions, right? So what needs to be done? Some proposals to ensure climate justice is what we are going to discuss in brief. So the first important thing which has to be done is we need to make sure that those who have historic emitters, they should immediately change their ways. They should immediately shift to renewables, immediately curtail their consumption, immediately go for degrowth. Okay, so this is a radical proposal. Other things could be like one might talk about a carbon tax. Carbon tax would mean the taxing the CO2 emissions. And there are certain figures which are churned out. For example, this is one figure which says that if you put a tax of $50 on every metric ton of carbon dioxide emitted in the industrialized world, then one can raise an amount of $450 billion annually, right? And this $450 billion annually can be used for pushing the green technologies, for changing the systems so that they are more environmental friendly, as well as for changing the lifestyles of the people in the developed world. If we tax them more, mm, tax them less, even of $25, that would yield amount of $250 billion per year. So this way one can do the work out, think of carbon taxation so that the fossil fuels use is curtailed. Uh, this was what was this is cited from a report which has been published by World Bank. It's an old report, but still one can think of the direction in which one can think of uh, curtailing the intervention in terms of climate justice. Another is taxing the 1%, which is what uh, some economists say, like Thomas Piketty. He has brought some data, a lot of research he has done, and he has brought for some data of inequity in the wealth. And he says that if there is so much of inequity, so much of difference in the incomes of the people, right? Then, and even if you consider 1% of those people, then, and if you tax them, okay, then one can raise a substantial amount of money. Okay, so some figure which has been cited by United Nations is about $50 billion, $46 billion can be collected by taxing the billionaires. So this way one can think of some innovative ways of making sure that the essential finance is raised for curtailing climate change and for ensuring climate justice. Another interesting figure I would like to share at the fag end of my lecture is, if you slash the military budgets, and we were discussing about the expenditure done by China, United States of America, and Russia. Okay, so slashing the military budgets of each of the top 10 military spenders by 25% would free up around $325 billion. So this is the research from a very well-known peace institute, Stockholm International Peace Research. Okay, so this you'll get such plenty of such proposals. Okay, what the point is, the key issue is about understanding that the climate justice would mean taxing the rich. We cannot go into the new world with curtailed emissions with the same lifestyles of the developed world. So the lifestyles of the developed people are to be curtailed, and some chance has to be given to the people who are not yet developed. Okay, unless and until we do that, unless and until there is degrowth, we cannot think of ensuring climate justice. So to end this lecture, I would again quote the speech of the Bolivian ambassador at the United Nations Climate Conference, where he says that if we are to curb emission in the next decade, we need a massive mobilization larger than any in history. So, if you know about some economics, you know that there was a Marshall Plan, okay, which was a major intervention into the economy of United States of America. So similar level of intervention, even a larger level of intervention to save this planet Earth would be necessary. Okay, and a massive mobilization of funds would be necessary to curb emissions in the next decade. And this obviously comes from a country like Bolivia, which is going to suffer a lot if and when the sea level rises. Okay, so this is the crux in the climate justice debate, that uh, a massive mobilization, massive change in the lifestyles, okay, and massive burden on those who have already caused enough damage to the climate change, okay, has to be borne, right? So I hope that I have laid some ground on which one can think of when you read the reports which are churned out by IPCC, and whenever you read some reports on climate change and carbon footprint. Okay, so this was a small contribution of mine to elaborate on the concept of global on carbon footprint, carbon space, and climate justice. See you. Bye for now.